Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. I am your host, Marcus Engel, and this is the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, inspire resilience, and provide perspective. So I'd like to share with you a little story back from my hospitalization and how it relates to humility. Whenever I was a patient, laying in that hospital bed, still on a trach. So this would have been very early on after the trauma that landed me in the hospital. Obviously still blind, still almost clinging to life, just a week or two post-trauma. And I remember one day being woken up out of a sound sleep by this booming, loud, excited voice that loomed over the top of my bed. And this is a very deep baritone voice that, like I said, literally boomed in the room. And this individual grasped my hand. His hand was this monstrous paw, like a big catcher's mitt. And this individual introduced himself by name. And he told me that I'm your speech pathologist and I'm going to see if I can get you talking here. Now, at this point in time, I was still using a pencil and paper to communicate by writing out everything on that tablet. And so I wrote out, who are you? And he tells me his name and he says, I'm going to work with your trach a little bit here. And I write out, is it going to hurt? At that point in time, I was still so incredibly injured that just bumping my bed a little bit, or if someone just even shook my hand a little too strong, it would just send off these mountains of pain throughout my body. And so I was very intrigued by this booming voice who identified himself as Dennis. And when Dennis started to tell me about what he was going to be doing to my trach, my question was, of course, is it going to hurt? He promised me it wouldn't hurt and that in a few moments we would start by counting out a few numbers, and it was going to be the first step to actually having a voice again. Now, the encounter was really awesome because he treated me like a human being. But after he was gone, I remember conversing with my parents, and they told me what they knew about him. And I wrote out on the paper, is he a doctor? Because he hadn't identified himself as doctor. And one of my parents said, well, I assume he is. He was wearing a white coat. Now, we all know that the white coat in healthcare, both in medicine and also now in nursing, is the symbol of the caregiver who is present. Well, he never really identified himself like what kind of doctor he was, and I didn't quite understand. I later learned that it wasn't because he was a PhD and not an MD that he failed to leave off identifying his title, but it was because of humility. He knew what he knew, and he didn't need a title to tell him that he was an expert in his field. And that humility is something that I really admired in Dennis, and it's something that I admire in people in general, and I'm sure that you do too. Lately, I just returned from a convention where I got to walk around in the exhibit hall and meet with literally hundreds of different organizations and companies and schools. And whenever I would meet with individuals in their booths exhibiting their organization and what their organization was all about, I always had some very good questions for the people in the booth. And I would be very honest by telling them, I am not a healthcare professional, but I would like to know about what you're talking about here in your booth. Are you a school? Are you a company? Are you a hospital or healthcare organization? What are you? And I stopped by a booth that you would know this name. If you were in healthcare, you would know the name of this organization. I would prefer not to tell you the name of this organization right now, just because I didn't ask their permission. But I stopped by their booth, and as we talked, I learned who the director of all of their nursing programs was. And they said, oh, not only is she the director of all of our nursing programs, but she's here today. In fact, she's over in the booth talking with somebody else right now. And so I waited around. And as soon as she was done talking with another potential customer or client, she came over to me and I said, oh, so I hear you're the top dog in nursing with this organization. And she said, oh, no. I'm not a top dog. I'm really just a puppy. And I laughed. She said, I'm really just a puppy. And I thought, once again, that putting out there of humility, I'm not the expert in the room, really reminds me, as someone who people seek out for expertise, it reminds me to be a student, to be humble about my position and about what I know, and to share that information freely, but to always be a student. And when you're a student, you're always learning, right? You're always learning. You're not yet an expert. It's one of the things that I really try to live my life by and remain a student, not only of my craft, of my business, of how I build relationships, but also to remember that in all things to act with humility. I think when we act in humility, we are showing the world that we know what we know, but we don't have to show what we know. I want to thank you all so much for being with me for this episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. Again, I'm your host, Marcus Engel, and this is the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, inspire resilience, and provide perspective. Thank you so much for being with me.